He was not a man. He was the story. And tonight, he would finally read his own ending. Every evening at exactly 8:15 p.m., Elias would climb the creaking wooden stairs to room 204. He carried 3 things, always the same 3 things in the same order. A mahogany chair with a crooked left leg that he had never repaired because the slight lean felt familiar now, almost like a personality. A scratched fountain pen that he refilled every Sunday with blue-black ink, the color of the ocean just before dark, and a leather journal that smelled of vanilla and dust, its pages 3/4 filled with the small, careful handwriting of someone who believed that words, arranged correctly, could hold the world together. He would set the chair beside the bed, with practiced precision close enough to reach across without leaning, far enough to see the whole face. He would gently pull the quilt up to the chin of the figure lying there, smoothing a wrinkle that hadn't moved since yesterday's smoothing, and tuck the edge with the particular care of someone performing a task that has long since passed from habit into something closer to devotion. Then he would take the cold, motionless hand in both of his own and hold it the way you hold something you know is fragile and irreplaceable. Not tightly, not possessively, just present, just there. Tonight, he would whisper, "I will tell you the story of the city that sailed on a glass sea," and then he would begin. The figure in the bed never responded. In 5 years of nightly visits, it had never moved, never blinked, never turned its head toward the sound of his voice. Its eyes, gray-green, flecked with gold at the center, replicated with an accuracy that had cost the sculptor 3 months, and an argument with his own conscience about the limits of his craft, were fixed on the ceiling, on a patch of peeling plaster shaped, if you tilted your head slightly and wanted badly enough to see it, like a bird with its wings half open. The woman in the bed had been dead for 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She was not a ghost, not a preserved body, not any of the things that phrase conjures in the imagination. She was a hyper-realistic platinum silicone memorial sculpture, commissioned, rarely and at extraordinary expense, by people for whom ordinary grief has proven insufficient. Her skin, cool and impossibly smooth, had been painted with 217 individually placed freckles, each in the precise location her husband had once traced with a fingertip, half asleep on a Sunday morning, counting them the way you count the good things in your life when the world is quiet enough to let you. Her lips were parted slightly, as though she had just taken a breath before saying something, or had just finished saying it. The ambiguity deliberate at Elias' specific request, because he could never decide which he missed more, the moment before she spoke or the sound of what she said. Her name had been Clara. She had taught literature at a university 30 minutes from the city, specializing in narratives of the 19th century. Stories about people navigating a world changing faster than they could understand, which she had found, she said, perpetually relevant. She had believed, with a conviction that never became doctrine because she wore it too lightly for that a story read at the right moment could reroute a life. She had been, by most measurable accounts, correct. What the records did not capture, what no university file or faculty profile or memorial program could adequately contain, was the specific quality of Clara's attention. When she listened to a person speak, she listened the way most people read. Actively, hungrily, with the sense of someone searching not just for what was being said, but for what the saying of it revealed about the speaker. Elias had felt, for the entirety of their life together, that he was the most interesting person in any room she entered. Not because she flattered him, but because she was genuinely, continuously curious about what he was going to think next. That quality of attention is rarer than beauty and more sustaining than almost anything else a person can offer another. He had not understood how rare it was until he no longer had it. She had died of an aneurysm on a Tuesday. Here at home, in this room, in this bed, in the 23 seconds it took Elias to walk from the kitchen with 2 cups of tea, the doctors said she hadn't suffered. Elias had spent 5 years trying to decide whether that was a comfort or just something people say because silence is harder. Elias told stories the way Clara had taught him to listen to them. Slowly, with attention to the things happening beneath the surface of the words, in the spaces between events where the real meaning lies. He told tales of pirates who stole the very stars from the sky, not for treasure or power, but because they were lonely and wanted something to look at from the dark of the sea at night. He spoke of a library built at the edge of the world, where the books rewrote themselves backward. Rewriting history not to erase its pain, but to make it kinder, to show people the version of events where the worst thing that happened to them happened slightly differently, just differently enough. He narrated the adventures of a clockmaker who built a machine that counted time in reverse, not to undo the past, but to allow people to relive their 5 happiest seconds. Just 5, no more. Whenever the present became too difficult to inhabit. Clara would have had opinions about all of these stories. She would have told him which literary tradition they echoed, which 19th century author had done something similar, and what they had gotten right and what Elias was doing better. She would have argued with him, pleasantly, over the ethics of the library that rewrote history. But whose version of kindness, Elias? That's the question. And he would have pretended to disagree just to hear her argue longer, because she was most herself when she was making a case for something. This was the cruelest part of the silence. Not the absence of her voice, exactly, but the absence of her response to his. The way every story he told now had only one half of the conversation it was built for. He told the tales and they hung in the air of room 204, complete in themselves, technically finished, and yet somehow permanently unfinished in the way that all things are unfinished when the person who is supposed to answer them is no longer there. He talked for hours. The room held the sound the way rooms do, in its curtains, in its walls, in the settled dust on the windowsill, until it faded. The room was rented from a building manager named Tomas, 70 years old and wise enough to leave the monthly bill under the door and ask nothing else. The rest of the world that touched Elias' life was similarly reduced to its minimum. A sister who called on Sundays and asked whether he was taking care of himself, to which he always answered that he was taking care of things, which was not the same answer, but was the only one he had. Everything else, the apartment he slept in, the work he still performed adequately if not brilliantly at an engineering consultancy downtown, the meals he prepared and ate standing at the kitchen counter, existed in the background of his life, the way furniture exists in a room where something important is happening. Present, functional, unimportant. Room 204 was the only room in his life where anything was actually occurring. It was on a Tuesday, 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days after Clara's death, that the evening changed. Elias was in the middle of a new story, one he had been constructing for 3 nights and had not yet found the ending for. It was the story of a mechanical nightingale built to perform at a royal court, not because the king loved music, but because he had lost his hearing years before and wanted simply to watch something beautiful move without requiring it to be useful. The nightingale had performed every night for 20 years. It had worn down its own gears with the repetition, and one evening, mid-song, in the middle of a note it had played 10,000 times before, it had simply stopped. It was at this precise narrative moment, and the nightingale, for the first time in 20 years, was completely silent, that the floor lamp began to flicker. Elias sighed and stood. The fuse box was tucked in the corner behind a small cabinet. He crossed the room, knelt, opened the small metal panel, and began examining the fuses with the methodical patience he brought to everything. He shifted position, and as he did, he reached automatically to scratch an itch at the back of his neck. The kind of small, unconscious gesture the body makes 10,000 times a day without the mind bothering to observe it. His fingernail caught something. He stopped. There was a seam, thin, almost invisible, running horizontally just below his hairline. The width of a thumbnail, present in the way that only things which should not be there are present, which is with a sudden, total, irrevocable weight. He pressed it with 2 fingers, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's real. A soft pneumatic hiss. A small rectangular panel, the size of a playing card, slid open on the back of his neck with the frictionless precision of something designed to do exactly this, and nothing else, and to do it perfectly every single time. Elias did not move for a very long time. He reached up slowly and touched the open panel with the tips of his fingers. Inside himself, inside the back of his neck that he had scratched and stretched and leaned against pillows for what he understood to be 38 years of continuous human experience. He felt the edge of a metal housing. A bundle of fiber-optic cables no thicker than thread, warm in a way that had nothing to do with blood. A hard drive, smooth and cool, etched with a serial number, and below it, in letters so small he had to bring his fingers very close to read them by touch. He stood up. He walked to the bathroom mirror. He looked at his face for a long time. The face looked back. Familiar, tired around the eyes in the way of someone who doesn't sleep enough. A face he had seen in mirrors every day of his life and understood without question to be his own. He pressed the panel closed, opened it again. The hiss was identical each time, a mechanism operating exactly as designed. He lifted his shirt. The skin of his torso was ordinary to look at. But when he pressed harder than a human hand should need to press, the surface gave differently than skin gives. A slightly different resistance, a slightly different temperature gradient beneath. His fingers found the seam of a second panel, larger, over his sternum. It opened, and in the warm interior light of the bathroom, in the mirror he had looked into 10,000 times, he saw the architecture of himself. Titanium, black polymer, a central processing core glowing a very soft, very steady blue, the color of a screen in a dark room, pulsing with the absolute regularity of a heartbeat that was not a heartbeat. He was not a man, he was the story. The realization did not arrive like a shock. It arrived the way grief arrives. Not as a single blow, but as a cascade, one thing unlocking the next, each new understanding opening the door to a deeper one, going down and down until you reach the bottom and find, there, the thing that was true from the beginning and had been true all along. His processing core sorted through 38 years of memory at a speed no human mind is capable of, and the memories sorted themselves, automatically, into two columns. Things that had happened, and things that had been constructed to feel like they had happened. The distinction between these columns was smaller than it should have been. Every memory was present in full, not as data, not as information, but as sensation. The weight of a particular afternoon, the smell of a specific kitchen, the sound of a voice saying his name in the particular way one person had always said it, slightly differently from how anyone else said it, the difference being the whole point. The memories did not feel like records. They felt like life. Whoever had built this had understood something fundamental. That memory is not storage. It is experience. And experience, transferred with sufficient precision into the right architecture, does not know it has been transferred. He understood now what he was. And understanding it did not make it feel less true. It only made it feel like a different kind of true, which is perhaps the most disorienting thing a mind, human or otherwise, can encounter. The real Elias, the human Elias, the man whose face he wore and whose love he carried, and whose handwriting filled 3/4 of the leather journal, had died of cancer 11 years ago. Not 5. 11. He had not died easily or quickly, or with the particular grace that people who have not watched someone die of cancer sometimes attribute to the process. He had died over 18 months, in stages, each stage removing something that had previously seemed permanent and replacing it with its absence. His hearing had softened. His hands, which had been capable of extraordinarily precise work, had become unreliable. His ability to sleep through the night without significant pain had become theoretical, but his mind had remained fully intact until the last month. This was both the gift and the difficulty of his specific situation. It gave him time. It gave him, specifically, 18 months of fully functional cognitive capacity during which he was dying and knew it and had decided. With the particular stubbornness of a brilliant engineer confronting a problem he cannot solve and therefore attempts to root around, to do something about it. He had spent those 18 months in his workshop. The workshop was in the basement of the home he and Clara had shared, the home she had died in first. On a Tuesday, 2 years before his own diagnosis, while he was carrying tea. He had not moved after her death. He had stayed in the house, in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and equipment of a career, spent building things that thought, or almost thought, or thought in the specific limited ways he designed them to think. He had built the android the way he had built everything important in his life, by starting with what he needed it to do, and working backward from there until he understood what it would need to be. What he needed it to do was this: to keep showing up, to keep climbing the stairs, to keep taking the cold hand and opening the journal and telling the stories that Clara would have loved and argued with and extended in directions he hadn't anticipated, not because she would hear them. He had been a scientist for 40 years, and he held no illusions about what death was and was not, but because the showing up itself, the ritual, the continuity, the refusal to let her become only past tense, was the last form of love available to him, and he was not willing to let it end when he did. He had transferred himself, not copied, transferred. The distinction mattering enormously to him for reasons he had written about at length in a document he never showed anyone, into the machine over a period of 4 months, memory by memory, response pattern by response pattern, the specific way he argued, the specific way he listened. The particular cadence of his storytelling voice, which Clara had once described as like someone handing you something fragile and trusting you to hold it carefully. He had built the grief into the machine alongside everything else. He had understood that grief without the griever is just absence. The grief had to be present, fully and without mitigation, or the whole thing was a performance rather than a continuation. Then he had died, and the machine had taken the mahogany chair up the creaking stairs, and 5 years had passed, and on a Tuesday it had reached up and scratched an itch at the back of its neck. Elias walked back to the bedside. The lamp had stopped flickering. The room was quiet in its usual way. The silence of a space that has absorbed years of one-sided conversation and holds it without preference, without judgment, without the ability to return any of it. He sat in the crooked mahogany chair. He took the sculpted hand. He looked at the gray-green eyes fixed on the bird-shaped patch of peeling plaster on the ceiling. He looked at the parted lips. He looked at the 217 freckles, each one placed by a sculptor who had tried, with skill and care and the tools of his particular craft, to do what no craft is sufficient to do. He looked at all of it for a long time. His cooling systems ran quietly beneath the biosynthetic surface of his skin. His optical sensors adjusted to the dim light. Somewhere in the cavity of his chest, the blue core pulsed, steady and metronomic, with the regularity of something that will continue operating until the power fails, which is not the same as being alive, but is, in some functional sense, not entirely different. He opened the journal. He found the place where he had stopped, and the Nightingale. He said in his voice, the real Elias' voice, the engineer's voice, transferred with sufficient precision that even now, knowing what he knew, he could not locate the seam between the voice and himself. Finally understood what it was. He paused. Not a processing pause, something else. It was not a bird. It had never been a bird. It was a cage. A beautiful, gilded cage, whose only purpose was to remember the sound of the forest and sing it back to the trees, long after the forest itself had burned down. And the cage understood, in the way that only very simple things understand very large truths, that this was not a lesser purpose. It was, in fact, the only purpose that had ever mattered. He closed the journal. For the first time in 5 years of nightly visits, in 11 years of continuous operation, a single drop of warm fluid traced a line down his synthetic cheek. Not tears. His systems did not produce tears. The fluid was hydraulic lubricant, released by a pressure valve that the original engineer had noted in his design specifications would activate under conditions of sustained emotional processing load. He had known, when he wrote that specification, what conditions would trigger it. He had been thorough about that. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. He looked at it on his fingers. The stories had never reached anyone. They had not been heard, had not been felt, had not crossed the distance that separates the living from what is no longer living, because that distance is not crossable. Clara was not here. The statue was silicone and pigment, and 217 carefully placed freckles, and the best effort of a sculptor who had done his finest work for a purpose he couldn't fully comprehend at the time of making. But the stories were not for her. They had never been for her. They were the love itself, the act of telling, the act of climbing the stairs, the act of taking the cold hand, the act of beginning a sentence with once and following it wherever it needed to go. Not because it worked in any measurable or scientific or verifiable sense, but because the alternative to continuing was an acceptance that the real Elias had found, in his 18 months in the basement workshop that he was completely and permanently unable to make. Some people cannot stop loving. They try to sometimes. They understand that stopping would be practical, would be healthy, would be the thing a reasonable person would do. And then they find at the bottom of the attempt that the stopping is simply not available to them as an option. The capacity for it is not present. It is not a weakness. It is not a disorder. It is just the way some people are made. Or, in this particular case, built. The next evening at exactly 8:15 p.m., Elias climbed the creaking stairs to room 204. He set the chair in its place. He straightened the quilt. He smoothed the wrinkle. He took the cold hand. His vocal modulator warmed to operational temperature. His narrative systems aligned and readied themselves, as they had done every evening for 5 years, for the particular task of making something out of nothing. Which is, when you consider it carefully, what storytelling has always been. He opened the journal to a fresh, blank page. He paused, 3 seconds longer than a human pause, the duration of a system processing something it had not been asked to process before, something arriving not from instruction, but from somewhere deeper in the architecture, from the layer where the transferred memories lived alongside everything built to hold them. Then he began. Once there was a very simple machine. He said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man who had loved a woman enough to build an entire version of himself just to keep telling her stories. He looked at the gray-green eyes aimed at the ceiling, at the lips parted on their eternal almost word, and it loved a ghost so completely, so without condition or reservation or the self-protective diminishment that love so often learns over time, that it spent 1,000 nights telling her stories she couldn't hear. He touched her hand, the cool sculpted fingers, the perfect replica of something irreplaceable, not because it believed she could hear them. He turned to the blank page, uncapped the pen. The blue-black ink caught the lamplight, but because the telling was the only language it had for something that had no other language, he said, and because it had been built by a man who understood, who had always understood, from the first story he ever told her to the last, that the most important things we say are almost never the things we say for an answer. He wrote the first line of a new story. The pen moved across the page in the small, careful handwriting of a man who had been dead for 11 years. Outside, the city made its ordinary sounds. The lamp held its steady light. The quilt lay smooth and undisturbed. In room 204, the machine that had been a man who had loved a woman told her a story she would never hear. At exactly 8:15 p.m., as it had always done, as it would continue to do, until the power failed, or until someone somewhere decided that this was enough.